Hi, Ted Morrissey here. I just want to make a video for my Lindenwood University MFA in Writing program course. It's a mouthful. This is our revisionist Shakespeare class, and particularly today, I want to talk a little bit about Othello, which we read last week and is still on your mind, I'm sure, as we move forward here. I have another video about Othello that I'm also going to give you a link to, a video I made when I taught the course previously, and I think that also has some worthwhile info. But I want to talk about a few different things in this video. Hopefully you'll take a look at both videos. But, last session, before I started teaching this class, this session, I was teaching my experimental writing course. And so my head's kind of still in the experimental writing space. So I wanted to focus this video on Shakespeare, the experimental writer. I think that Shakespeare has become so canonical. In fact, he's kind of the epitome of the Western canon that we just think of everything he wrote as just sort of classic and unquestionable, and he was the greatest writer in the English language, and on and on and on. But that's how we think of him now. In his own day, obviously, he had to carve out a place for himself in a very competitive London, where there were lots of playwrights, lots of other theaters and companies of actors at work. And so his success was not assured, right? And so he actually took a lot of risks as a playwright and as a poet, and we kind of forget about that if we just think of him as sort of this godlike, writer, this sort of the head of the pantheon of Western, literary culture or whatever, right? So I want to talk a little bit about some of his risk taking, some of his experiments, which in retrospect we say that they are master strokes of genius, but at the time that wasn't necessarily a given. And for a long while after Shakespeare was long gone, there were, people who questioned some of the plays and criticized some of the plays as maybe not being strokes of genius and having their flaws and that kind of thing. Right. So again, I just want to kind of focus on a few of the aspects of Shakespeare in general and Othello in particular that speak to his experimentalism, his risk-taking, and so forth. I've moved behind me here my facsimile of the Folio. Maybe you can get a sense of how big this bad boy is. But this is a facsimile, a copy of the first Folio from 1623. As you know, it was put together as a project primarily by two of the actors from Shakespeare's acting company. Shakespeare had been dead for 7 years by the time the Folio came out. It's a source of a lot of scholarship just in itself, in terms of looking at the plays and the versions of the plays that are in the Folio. There are some plays that there were little smaller quarto editions published before the first Folio. So we do have multiple versions in some cases, but there are 18 of the 37 plays that only appear in the Folio. So if we didn't have the Folio, presumably those plays would have been lost. And we probably have lost some plays, we're pretty sure we have, that didn't end up in the Folio, and we don't have quartos of them and that kind of thing. But there's, a lot of time spent looking at various versions of the plays and making decisions about what might be, the best version, the most effective version, and so on. In the case of Othello, there was a Folio edition. There was a quarto edition in addition to the Folio. So scholars have been able to look at both versions. There's a fair amount of difference between the two in terms of the number of lines. There's some scenes that are in one and not the other. And so what modern editors do oftentimes is sort of take a little bit here and a little bit from there and come up with what they think is the best version of Othello. All right. So In terms of the experimental kind of risk-taking nature of Othello, we know today, and in fact that we talked about this on the discussion board, a lot of you talked about this on the discussion board, the play, it seems even more relevant today than it was maybe even just a couple of years ago, or going back 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, 400 years, whatever you want to say. It deals with racism. It deals with misogyny. It deals with gaslighting. It deals with how easily people are led astray by deliberate misinformation. Quite honestly, this is the first time I've taught this play where that has been a major focus of the conversation. Yes, traditionally it's dealing with racism, is violence toward women. All of those things are sort of standard issues to look at, as well they should be. And unfortunately, they continue reading upon reading upon reading to be, important issues. They never go away. And certainly with the overturning of Roe versus Wade and all of the legislation and litigation that is pending regarding women's autonomy to their own bodies and to reproductive rights, all those kinds of things make issues that Othello talks about in terms of, again, misogyny, the dominance of women, the sort of pain and violence inflicted on women. Those kinds of things are all very much in the news and make the play even more relevant today. But this idea of gaslighting is fairly new. It's just something we've really talked about too much over the years when we've talked about Othello, but it certainly is pertinent today. Now, when Shakespeare wrote Othello, he again was taking some risks, right? We don't know the exact timing of all the plays. We think we have a pretty good idea the sequence of them when Shakespeare wrote them in connection in context with each other. The approximate years, sometimes we have a pretty definite idea, and then other times it's much more a matter of guesswork. But scholars are pretty well convinced that Othello was the play that he wrote after Hamlet, which was Hamlet was around 1601 or so. We think that Othello was maybe written, again shortly thereafter, maybe performed for the first time in 1603. But again, just kind of guessing here. I mentioned in the discussion board that Shakespeare was inspired by a lot of things, and we're talking about him in a revisionist context, and he was revising a novella which he had read, and which has the kind of basic story that he drew from for his Othello story, making some significant changes along the way as he tended to. But he also was drawing from current affairs, and in fact, on the cover of my Norton edition is a portrait of the Moor ambassador who was in the court of Queen Elizabeth in the year 1600 to 1601. The Moors were in conflict with the Catholics of Spain, and England, of course, also considered Spain an adversary, because at this time Queen Elizabeth's England was Protestant. And so the Moors of North Africa kind of adopted the idea, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so this gentleman came to Elizabeth's court and was there for a year or so, trying to convince her that an alliance between the Moors of North Africa and England was advantageous for both groups. So it's pretty likely, pretty certain that Shakespeare would have met this gentleman, but certainly would have seen him at court. He and other of his entourage from North Africa. And so when he was working on the play Othello and was sort of envisioning what Othello might physically look like and how he might be costumed, it's very possible that this was the idea that he had in mind. Now, we don't know that for sure. Historians and scholars have kind of come up with that idea. But one way that Shakespeare was risk-taking was this combining of existing material with contemporary affairs. We know that he oftentimes was drawing on events in the news as we would think of it for his plays. They obviously are remote to us, from 400 years ago. And it takes, reading the footnotes and some of the scholarly material to understand what Shakespeare was up to. But he was oftentimes taking uh, past events, either literary, texts or historical events or whatever it might be, and weaving them together with a lot of different influences, including current affairs, not to mention his own creativity, his own imagination, that kind of thing. And Othello, it seems to be definitely in that camp. Again, combining an existing novella with this current affair of a possible alliance between the Moors of North Africa and Queen Elizabeth and her court in England and so on, and then just Shakespeare's imagination. Would he know that that was going to be a recipe for success and that 400 years later we will be talking about this play still? No, of course not. Maybe, he was risking alienating people in his audience who maybe had strong political views one way or another, strong religious views one way or another. But he was taking those various elements and putting them together. And again, we can look at just about all of his plays, and we can find examples of that. We'll certainly be talking about that when we get to The Tempest. But there are a lot of plays where Shakespeare is weaving in current affairs with existing texts. In some cases, it may be that he is revising an earlier play that he wrote to make it contemporary. And in particular, I'm thinking of the play Macbeth, which has one section in particular, and perhaps multiple allusions to the gunpowder plot, which happened in 1605. But most scholars feel like the play was probably written before that. But yet, again, parts of it seem to definitely allude to that. So it's possible that he wrote the bulk of the play before that event, that attempted assassination of James I and basically the entire government, and then wove that into a later production, and that is the text that eventually ended up in the first folio, which is what we have today, right? In terms of, again, getting back to Othello, now we tend to think of Shakespeare's plays in these three categories, these sort of famous categories of the tragedies, the comedies, and the histories. But those are actually kind of misleading labels. And the only reason we talk about them is because the editors of the first folio, the publisher of the first folio, came up with those divisions and slotted the various plays into these different pigeonholes of either being a tragedy or a comedy or a history. And so we've kind of stuck with those basic labelings, but they really aren't very accurate. Now the tragedy and the comedy, obviously that comes from the ancient tradition of Greek theater, and those were the two sort of basic kinds of plays that there were. And whether something was a tragedy or a comedy was really more about structure and particular elements in the play, and not whether it was tragic or comedic, as we tend to use those words today. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. This third category, this history category, that was something that was unique to Shakespeare in terms of his taking stories from English history and retelling them, oftentimes with considerable artistic license. But again, another way that he was experimenting. Other playwrights weren't doing that. They were sticking to this sort of traditional tragedy or comedy approach, but Shakespeare was inventing this other kind of thing. And for that matter, plays like The Tempest, Midsummer Night's Dream, and so on don't really fit into any of those categories very well. And sometimes scholars will refer to them as romances. And so they're kind of a fourth category, but yet obviously they have elements of other categories in there as well. So this sort of cross-genre thing that Shakespeare was doing, and the invention of a new genre, very experimental. Again, no guarantee that audiences are going to respond favorably to them, but they did, right? At least for a time. And so in Othello, we have a play that we call a tragedy, But in Shakespeare's day, it broke some rules that tragedies were supposed to follow, and therefore received some criticism, or at least some critics at the time who said overall it was a good play, it was a successful play, but it had these kind of flaws that kept it from being a really really great play. For one thing, a tragedy was supposed to have only one location. All the action was supposed to be very compressed and it was all supposed to take place in one location. And Shakespeare throws that right out the window by having Venice be the setting of the opening section. And very quickly we move to Cyprus, where the rest of the play takes place. Some editors of Shakespeare, some performers of Shakespeare in the years since tried to improve the play by basically eliminating the Venice scene and whatever information from that scene that we need later in the play, just sort of bringing it in through dialogue and that kind of thing. So trying to improve on Shakespeare by correcting one of his errors by adding another setting to otherwise what should be a play with only one setting because it's a tragedy. Another thing that I got a dog that's supposed to bark here. Could happen any second, so I'm gonna have to pause. So another thing that Shakespeare did, which was hang on. Another thing that Shakespeare does in Othello and other plays, but in Othello II, is in terms of rule breaking. The audiences of Shakespeare's day expected that any sort of violence would take place off stage. Characters could allude to it. Maybe you could kind of hear it off stage, but it wasn't front and center on the stage. Shakespeare, again, threw that right out the window. In a lot of his plays, we have, fight scenes taking place right there on the stage. And in fact, that becomes sort of a staple of Shakespeare's productions. His acting company was particularly well practiced in fight scenes, in choreographing them, and they could be quite exciting and spectacular. And we know that he would even make them more spectacular by making them more gruesome. For example, he would use what today we think of as sort of fake blood packets. If you're in the theater, as I know some of you are, for special effects, there's fake blood, and you can have fake blood packets that are charged so that they kind of spurt out or whatever. In Shakespeare's day, the way they took care of that was there were butcher shops all over the place in London. They didn't have refrigeration. They didn't have ways to preserve meat. So if you were going to eat meat, it had to be really fresh. So consequently, there were butcher shops, in basically every neighborhood. And we know that there were butcher shops near the Globe Theater. And so what Shakespeare's prop master would do is on the way to the theater on the day of a production would stop by the butcher shop and get some pig's bladders and would fill them with blood, animal blood, and would sew them shut, sort of like water balloons, except they were pig bladders filled with blood. And then during the fight scenes, actors would, tuck one under an arm or whatever, and at just the right moment, we get stabbed, in the pig bladder. But of course, obviously, from the view of the audience, it looked like they were getting stabbed in the stomach or the chest or wherever it might be, and blood would spurt out, from this pig bladder balloon thing, and so very gory, very spectacular, and something that Shakespeare was getting particularly adept at in his plays. Other playwrights may have also been doing that to some degree. But again, we know that by and large, before Shakespeare came along, that it was considered rather gauche to have violence on the stage. It was all supposed to be off stage or implied or whatever. So again, risk taking. Would the audience respond to it? Shakespeare had no idea. but obviously they did, right? So that's another way that Shakespeare was sort of taking chances, and in retrospect, it paid off for him, right? Um, we have talked a little bit about Shakespeare's language, and obviously that's one of the main focuses of Shakespeare's study, the power of the language, the power of the imagery, and so on. The thing is, Shakespeare is doing a lot of things with language that I don't think anyone could realistically believe that audiences would necessarily pick up on. In other words, you really have to be reading the plays as texts and reading them carefully and rereading them carefully to pick up on a lot of the things that are going on the page in terms of metaphors at work, in terms of language play. We talked about via another note that I sent you the critic Frank Kermode's observation that Othello's language changes during the course of the play from a sort of very grand, almost exotic style of speech to something very much more common and base by the end of the play. So it's as if Iago has not just corrupted Iago's ethics and morals and his soul, but that's also demonstrated through his sort of corrupted dialogue by the end of the play. So in 1603, when audiences were sitting there on the globe, listening, watching Othello, were they picking up on this fact? Seems kind of unlikely, right? At least not most of them. Maybe a particularly, critically listening observer, maybe seeing the play more than once or something, but probably not. That's probably something that you only can pick up on if you read the play carefully and so on. And there's a lot of things in Shakespeare's plays that are like that really can only be detected and discussed and understood if read on the page. You can't possibly expect someone, even in Shakespeare's day, where people's listening skills, their attention spans, etc., were by and large better than ours today, because we just don't have to listen that carefully. We have obviously much shorter attention spans. Our memories are not nearly as sharp as what they were in Shakespeare's day, before you could just use electronic devices to recall information and so on. But in spite of all that, Shakespeare's audience still probably wasn't able to pick up on all the complexities of language that he was using. So why use them? Again, did he anticipate that his plays were going to be published in full or nearly full, perhaps, and that people were going to be studying them for centuries? Probably not. But that's probably why they were published. That's probably why, after his death, his acting friends thought it was worthwhile to pursue creating that thing, which was very unusual. That kind of a book was not what was used to produce plays. Again, the little Quarto, kind of cheap, almost like what we would think of as kind of paperback editions. Yes, those would be published pretty readily with plays in them and poetry and that kind of thing, but not big, expensive, folio size books. That was reserved for the Bible and other theological texts and that kind of thing, not for literature, especially not drama, which is what's kind of a common form of literature at the time. But they thought that it was a good idea to try to preserve Shakespeare's language, and so they did, and thank goodness, right? So again, what's this have to do with his experimentation? He could have, staged the plays, the action of the plays, the character development, all those things without putting as much attention and detail into the quality of the language, into the subtexts, into the invention of new words, which of course we know Shakespeare did readily. But yet he tried all those things. And I'm a kind of firm believer that even though we may not consciously be able to pick up on all those things when we watch the play, that they still have perhaps a sort of subliminal effect on us, that we get a sense of the complexity of the language, even though we may not be able to articulate and give back specific examples just from having watched the play, but yet it's kind of layers of again, complexity that kind of build up. I kind of think of it as a great painter, how they will paint layers and layers of color before they ultimately kind of put the primary image onto the canvas. And so when an observer looks at the Mona Lisa or looked at whatever, what they think they're seeing is, oh, well, there's the portrait of a woman, or there's a biblical scene, or whatever it might be. They aren't able to really see that there's 7 or 8 or 12 layers of color there in the kind of background, but yet it has an impact on their sense of the painting and its complexity, its depth, its texture, all those kinds of things, right? So I think Shakespeare was doing that as well, all right? I got some notes here. I just want to make sure I don't miss anything. So, another thing I wanted to throw out there in terms of Shakespeare taking some chances were his development of strong female characters. Now, we can look back on his characters from a 21st century perspective, and we can find areas where they seem a little bit weak here or there. We can find examples of some of the stronger female characters who maybe have moments of weakness in the plays or whatever. But at the time, having strong female characters at all was unusual. And one of the reasons that many of Shakespeare's plays stick in our mind, and the reason they've been produced so many times and have had multiple movie versions and have inspired so many other writers, is because of the female characters, maybe more so than the male characters. I've mentioned that Macbeth is kind of the main play that I've taught over the years, and the play, therefore, I know best. And the play I've seen produced live, more than any other, and seen multiple movie versions of Macbeth. And I think Lady Macbeth is in many ways a much more interesting and complex character than Macbeth is, now, who is also very interesting and complex. But I think Lady Macbeth is a very complex character. You can look to all sorts of female characters in Shakespeare, even though there aren't really that many. If you look at the plays as a whole, definitely there are much more male characters. And of course, you have the sort of classic, males playing females, playing males within the play itself. And we know that a lot of that is because of the laws that prevented women from acting on the stage in London and environs and so forth. And so they had to use, young male actors, probably teenage boys, to play a lot of the female roles. So there aren't a lot of female roles total compared to the number of male roles. But the female roles he did write, there are some really interesting, complex, characters with a lot of depth. Got to let my dog in now. Hang on. Got to pause again. Okay, back. So female characters, right. So we can point to a lot of really interesting female characters. I mentioned Lady Macbeth already. Obviously, Desdemona is an interesting and strong character in many ways, defying her father to marry Othello in the first place. Emilia obviously becomes a strong figure by the end of the play Othello. But again, we can point to numerous strong female characters in Shakespeare. I think of Kate in The Taming of the Shrew. Speaking of which, that's another Shakespearean invention of sorts that has spawned all kinds of imitators, or at least revisionists over the centuries. And what I mean by that are the sparring male and female couples, right? So we have Taming of the Shrew. We have Much Ado About Nothing, with Beatrice and Benedict. We then lead into all kinds of those sorts of characters in literature. So we think of the Jane Austen characters and Pride and Prejudice and so on. And again, we can go right up to the present moment, basically, and find these kind of sparring couples who on the surface seem to not really care for each other, to be very critical of each other, but yet there's an attraction between them and so on. Again, how many examples can we think of that? But we can go back to Shakespeare to find his kind of popularizing those kinds of relationships in several of his plays. All right. So I didn't want this to be terribly long, and it's about 30 minutes. So I'm going to stop right there. But again, I just wanted to underscore that while we think of Shakespeare as very traditional, canonical, whatever kind of word you want to use, in his time period, he was a real risk taker, very experimental, breaking a lot of rules. And I think that's why we're still talking about his plays 400 years later, whereas many of his contemporaries, though talented, Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, et cetera, get some attention, but mainly from scholars today. They don't get a lot of, kind of popular attention like Shakespeare does. And I think what separated him from all of his contemporaries was his risk taking, his experimentation, particularly in his use of language, the way he developed characters, and so on. All right, so I'm going to stop there. I'd be curious to know what you think about Shakespeare as experimentalist, as risk taker, and I will see you down the digital trail.